It's time now for the news review of this bulletin. Iran's top general warns of ramifications of the growing military partnership between the U.S. and the Israeli regime in the Persian Gulf region. Major General Mohammad Bagheri says the U.S. military has tried to make up for the withdrawal of its warships from the region by connecting the, quote, child-killer Israeli military to the U.S. Central Command. He said the cooperation will provide the Israeli regime with America's spying facilities. The chairman of the Chiefs of Staff of the Iranian Armed Forces noted that the partnership will increase threats to Iran. Bagheri, however, has warned regional countries hosting American and Israeli forces against any threat to Iran's security. He underlined that the Islamic Republic has always urged its neighbors not to rely on foreigners for regional security. Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm is a political commentator who joins us from Tehran. We also have DeBar, a radio host, journalist, and political activist, joining us from New York. Welcome to you both. Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, I'd like to start with you first. So tell us exactly this configuration that Israel and the U.S. have concocted here. Is it correct to conclude that Israel, through Centcom, which obviously is American-run, of which there are U.S. military bases in countries in the region, will now be able to militarily execute what it wants based on the bases that it has in these various countries, which are the Persian Gulf Arab countries, which hence maybe explains why U.S. and Israel are so keen on this so-called normalization between these countries? Mostafa Khoshcheshm, did you hear me? DeBar, did you hear me?
Yes, I did.
Okay, question to you then. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's a reflection that, the fact that this is becoming more and more an integrated command, essentially the so-called IDF, being partnering, quote unquote, with Centcom, which is the central command of the U.S. military, is a reflection of the condition of hostilities at this point that actually constitute a war with multiple fronts. You have a front on Russia's border with Ukraine. You have a front in Syria with the U.S. occupation there and regular Israeli raids. You have a front in Yemen. You have a front still smoldering in Iraq. Just the entire area is in a state of war. And as the war becomes more and more actualized, you're going to see a more and more obvious or public viewing of the integration of command in these areas. So it's not a surprise that we're seeing this. You look at Albania, what's happening there. You're looking at the situation with the various types of computers, whatever you call the electronic espionage and attacks and warfare. And the ongoing media battle where Iran's media has been frozen out of the international, you can't broadcast in these large pieces of territory. It's clear that there's a war that's ongoing. We're not falling into one, we're in one. And the fact that we see an integrated command now in front of us shouldn't surprise anyone. I don't really think it's a change of anything other than visibility.
Mm-hmm. Well, Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, how do you see this? I mean, Iran obviously it does not like it, and it's. I'm curious whether it's Israel now part of Centcom in a sense, or operating through Centcom, which I'm guessing has, as I asked DeBar, that the U.S. has these military bases in regional countries, and therefore perhaps there was a push for normalization of ties. Maybe this is part of the reason.
Hello, and thanks for having me. That's true, exactly. The United States is on decline, and it means to create a World War II-like situation and environment in the whole world. So it has started some kind of proxy warfare against the Russians at the cost of the Europeans. Also, they have escalated tensions in the Taiwan Strait and escalated tensions against China at the cost of Taiwan. And they plan to do the same now that the JCPOA talks has entered another phase, another statement, and another phase of war of willpower. They have escalated tensions against Iran under the same pattern, Some might believe that that the United States, because it's decreasing forces and redeploying to the South China Sea, and it doesn't want to leave its Arab allies in the region, disappointed. So they have started some kind of reconnaissance mission in the Strait, in the Strait of Hormuz, through this, sea drones, to collect information to help them and to reduce numbers of forces and regional, bases, but to make use of electronics and, semi-automatic, robotic things, and by just advancing advanced technology. But this is not the case. Intel shows that they need to spy on the Iranians in the patrolling the region in order to find suitable route to spread Israeli warships and also submarines into the Persian Gulf. This is not going to be tolerated by Iran, as has been warned repeatedly by chief Iranian officials and army commanders. One of the tactics used by the United States is that once they are redeploying to the South China Sea, they mean to start a coalition, Arab-Israeli coalition, to be aided and assisted by the NATO allies in the Persian Gulf, and to replace themselves with them in order to slow down Iran's regional growth, in their absence. So initially, it started under Donald Trump in the last 1 or 2 years after normalization of ties in the last couple of years of his presidency. But they failed. As soon as the Israeli submarines and warships meant to leave the Red Sea and through the Bab el-Mandeb, the Iranian army sent flotillas to confront them. At least 2 confrontations happened, and the Israelis moved back. Then they started the war games with their Arab allies, Israeli Arab war games. Some 20 countries or more were present and participated in that. And then now they're thinking of how to spread to the Arab Sea from the Red Sea, then to the Sea of Oman and the Persian Gulf. And they are spying on Iranian forces. And let's remember that Iran has the lengthiest coastline, and it's officially internationally in charge of the Strait of Hormuz that happens to be on the Iranian side, actually. And it's in charge of managing and controlling safe shipping in the region. And the United States or others should receive permission from the Iranians. That has been the case always. It means that they are only allowed to have safe passage through the strait, and they cannot impose or meddle with the management of this strait. That's what they are trying to do.
Well, Don DeBar, what's confusing here is how much is Israel going to be, aggressive in wanting to somewhat indirectly, maybe even provoke Iran if it gets into this game with Centcom? Or will Centcom be a front? Not too clear as to the way Israel is going to operate here, because we know that there's no way that Israel wants to just be present to be present. I'm sure it's going to have some motives.
Yeah, well, first of all, there's the motives of the elite in Israel, of course, and the motives of the elite in the United States as well. We're talking about a question of form rather than substance. Military is not the United States. It's the United States intel agencies are not the United States. These are entities that are created from the wealth of the people of the United States and turned into weapons that are put at the disposal of a very small elite here. And the same with Israel. The state itself is a product of that elite, as a matter of fact. And so, although you have multiple forms that you can present, the same people put Nazis in power in Kiev and social democrats in power in Germany, or even Greens. The same program goes on. The same folks are in charge of both. It's a matter of which face do they show at what time for public relations value, really. So, the fact that they're formally acknowledging the integration of these things now, I think, is essentially a formal acknowledgement of the fact that there's a state of war.
Final question, quickly, if you can, say, Mostafa Khoshcheshm. Does this then erase the threats that Israel has leveled against Iran? that it's going to go on its own without U.S. support to attack Iran? We know that it has made several threats of that nature, given the fact that it's now integrated with Centcom?
I doubt so. I mean, they don't dare to do that alone. They know it. These are boastful remarks. They're not that size. They're not even the size of the Lebanese Hezbollah, let alone Iran. But it's probable that they go for threatening. I mean, they play in the gray zone between war and peace, and by mistake, unknowingly, they might cross the red line. This is going to happen as they are already playing with fire. Not only the Israelis, but the Americans, through this kind of reconnaissance and spying operation in the Persian Gulf, they have enraged chief Iranian military officials. This is unanticipated. I've never seen that. So many people, top military brass are enraged at the Americans on the southern rims of the Persian Gulf, as well as the Israelis. They have issued warnings repeatedly in the last couple of days, and I believe Israel is soon to pay the price, especially as the JCPOA talks has started some kind of stalemate and tensions are escalated. And the Israelis have proved to be so foolish to include Iran in their election and domestic politics, and they are foolish enough to cross the red line.
Thank you for that. Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, political commentator. Don DeBar, pleasure. Radio host, journalist, and political activist from New York.